Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. Thanks for joining us. What we know is that there was an emotional moment today in the White House briefing room after a very passionate defense of the president's handling of a condolence call. That was a phone call that was criticized in the way in which President Trump handled it. But today we heard something that we have not heard before, and that is the president's chief of staff, retired Marine Corps General John Kelly, give a deeply personal defense of how the president, in fact, spoke to the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. Let's go ahead and play some of that.
Let me tell you what my best friend, Joe Dunford, told me, because he was my casualty officer. He said, Kel, he was doing exactly what he wanted to do when he was killed. He knew what he was getting into by joining that 1%. He knew what the possibilities were because we're at war. And when he died, in the 4 cases we're talking about, Niger, my son's case in Afghanistan, when he died, he was surrounded by the best men on this earth, his friends. That's what the president tried to say to 4 families the other day. I was stunned when I came to work yesterday morning and brokenhearted at what I saw a member of Congress doing. A member of Congress who listened in on a phone call from the President of the United States to a young wife, and in his way tried to express that opinion. He's a brave man, a fallen hero. He knew what he was getting himself into because he enlisted. There's no reason to enlist. He enlisted. And he was where he wanted to be, exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the people he wanted to be with when his life was taken. That was the message. That was the message that was transmitted. It stuns me that a member of Congress would have listened in on that conversation. Absolutely stuns me. And I thought at least that was sacred.
General Kelly was speaking there about his own experience when his son Robert, who was in the Marines, was killed in combat in 2010. Now, after the briefing, I had a chance to speak with CBS News Radio's Stephen Portnoy about that powerful moment.
I'm not sure any of the reporters in this room have ever here in this space seen a more poignant personal reflection from a government official here to reporters talking about the personal loss and the reflections that we heard from Chief of Staff General John Kelly, who, as you probably know, lost his 29-year-old Marine son in 2010 and was on the other end of that notification. He received the word from General Joseph Dunford, who was the Joint Chiefs Chairman at the time, and who you heard General Kelly talk of here as someone who gave him advice as how to deal with the loss that people feel when they are themselves suddenly Gold Star families. We heard General Kelly explain how he advised President Trump how to make phone calls to those family members of the fallen. He said that it's the most difficult call. It's more difficult than you can imagine. There's no perfect way to make that phone call. He says he advised the president at first not to do it. But he also said that he suggested that when he heard from General Dunford and when they discussed his own loss, that General Dunford comforted General Kelly by saying that his own son did what he wanted to do and was doing what he wanted to do. And you could tell from what General Kelly was saying that that's what President Trump was trying to convey to the widow he spoke with this week. What General Kelly said was that he was appalled that Frederica Wilson, the congresswoman from Florida, listened in on that call and then told reporters about it. He said, "Is nothing sacred?" As I say, there are rare examples, if any, here in this briefing room of something more poignant and powerful from a government official.
And Stephen, just to give us some context and perspective, it's not often that we hear from General Kelly, is it?
I'm sorry, if you could just repeat that question.
Yeah, it's not often that we hear from General Kelly in such a public fashion.
No, not at all. In fact, this is only, to my mind, the second time that we've heard from General Kelly here in this briefing room. It was last week when he came in to address reporters on the reports that he was so miserable in the job that he was thinking of leaving. So clearly now General Kelly has established when he feels strongly enough about something that he knows that he is in the discussion, that he feels it's important to come out here and talk to reporters. He spoke for about 20 minutes and did take a few questions from reporters. You saw that he was most interested in hearing questions from reporters who had familiarity with Gold Star families. He did ask us if any of us knew someone who had suffered the same sacrifice that, again, he did. The general clearly felt that this was something that he personally wanted to address, and he clearly felt most strongly about the Congresswoman and what she had to say about it. What was not asked was how he felt about the fact that the president invoked his name. And that's important to remember, because it was on Monday in the Rose Garden here in a freewheeling 40-minute press conference in which the president first said, when he was asked about why he hadn't spoken about the death of 4 service members in Niger, he said, well, we're preparing to make the phone calls. And you heard General Kelly explain that process. And then he said that other presidents, specifically Barack Obama, did not make phone calls. And then Tuesday morning, in a radio interview, the president said, you should ask General Kelly if Barack Obama called him. Now, here today, the general did say that he never got a call from President Obama. It was later and through yesterday that the controversy built, where Congresswoman Wilson said that she was in on that call in which the president said that the fallen service member essentially knew what he was getting into. But it was President Trump who first invoked General Kelly's name, and that was Tuesday morning.
Yeah, and it was interesting. We heard General Kelly basically say, though, when he was giving the explanation of President Obama not having called him, that it wasn't necessarily a political thing, that it was sort of the way it happened. And he gave a little bit of additional context, too, that, in fact, was deeply personal about his own experience and how the only calls that mattered were the calls from his son's friends who were still in theater. So it was a defense, certainly, of this president's handling of the situation, I thought, with a very, very poignant, as you said, and personal reflection as well. What else did we hear? There were some questions that he took on the issue of Niger.
He was asked essentially what the United States has been doing in Niger, and I've been looking back at some White House filings up to Capitol Hill, essentially biannual notifications that the White House is required by law to make to Congress as to where American forces are stationed all over the world. And I was looking up the fact that American forces have been in Niger in this essentially advise and assist capacity for many years now. In fact, it was in the late first or early second term of Barack Obama. I went back as far back as 2013 and saw that there were a couple of hundred American troops in Niger. This incident, October 4th of 2017, was the first incident in which 4 service members were killed in this ambush attack. A question that General Kelly was not asked beyond why Americans are in Niger, and he suggested it was similar to other missions in other places, Okinawa, South Korea, where American troops are stationed to advise and assist and basically be a force protection. But he was not asked about the specifics of what it is those soldiers were doing on patrol. The Pentagon has so far reported that the service members in Niger were there to train the Nigerian I have to look up the adjective form.
Yeah,
yes,
Nigerian,
thank you very much. They were there to essentially help those troops take on a branch of Al-Qaeda. But they were attacked by an offshoot of ISIS, 2 separate and distinct organizations. They had conducted at least 29 separate patrols and had had no incidents. There was a briefing slide in which they were told that they should not expect any encounter with the enemy. Well, they did face a very bold enemy, a well-equipped enemy, a well-coordinated enemy, and that's what resulted in the October 4th ambush attack that killed 4 service members.
All right, Stephen. Stephen Portnoy of CBS News Radio on an extraordinary day in the briefing room. Thanks so much, Stephen.
You bet.